The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was a confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. After two world wars, human beings are facing the risk of a third war breaking out. This time, nuclear war is enough to destroy everything. Thanks to the concession between the two powers, the missile crisis was resolved peacefully. Let's find out the history. Americans were afraid of the strength of the Soviet Union, especially in Latin America. That worry was reinforced when it is in 1959 Cuba was born. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency under President John F. Kennedy spent money and effort supporting Cuban casualties to carry out a plan of rebellion. But these Cubans failed to land on the southwestern coast of Cuba, also known as the Playa Girón Bay, Cuba, in 1961. Former President Eisenhower warned President John F. Kennedy that the failure of the Cubans was a failure. The Playa Girón Bay lawsuit would spur the Soviets to revolt. U.S. covert operations continued until 1961 with Operation Mongoose, but were still unsuccessful. In February 1962, the United States imposed an economic embargo against Cuba. Therefore, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Soviet combat units and weapons, including ballistics and nuclear weapons, were delivered to Cuba. This was a reason for the United States to deploy dozens of missiles in Italy and Turkey. In July 1962, military equipment and weapons were loaded onto the ships. Faced with that situation, the United States began to install CIA officials in Cuba. Even Senator Kenneth B. Keating warned the United States that the Soviet Union might be building a military base in Cuba. So, the American warships required the Soviet ships to present documents about the goods being transported. On September 14, 1962, a U.S. U-2 The Dragon Lady discovered the Soviet medium-range missile base in La Habana. October 16, President John F. Kennedy and the military command of the Supreme Court of the United States held an emergency meeting to come up with a solution. This was the period of imminent missile crisis. According to experts, if war broke out, if the hit rate of the Soviet missiles was 100%, the interception rate was 0%, then after only 5 minutes, the US would have 8 million dead. More than 40,000 Marines and 90,000 US infantry have been mobilized. The most elite 101st Airborne Division of the US Army was also put in a state of combat readiness. President John F. Kennedy had three options. The first was to destroy weapons by accurately hitting small targets. The second was to launch a full-scale military campaign in Cuba. Third was to arrange a naval blockade on the island, and he chose the second way. At 7 p.m. on October 22, 1962, the U.S. ordered a sea blockade with Cuba. Soon after, the U.S. President ordered the Army to get ready for battle. An American Navy assembled in the Caribbean. Half the fleet was also ready to fight. Along with armed activities, many intelligence letters were opened with the Soviet government, and the President Kennedy expressed a desire to reconcile. He even agreed to dismantle the missile system in Turkey to want the Soviet Union to destroy the missile system in Cuba. On October 27, 1962, the Soviet Army destroyed an American U-2 plane over Cuba. This would be the cause to prepare for a nuclear war. American troops had gathered in Florida and were ready to invade Cuba. But on October 28, both sides reached an agreement for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The US would ship missiles out of Turkey within 6 months and promised not to invade Cuba. The Soviet Union would pull its nuclear weapons out of Cuba. American officials also agreed to withdraw their nation's missiles from Turkey, which had been a secret for 17 years. On October 29, Soviet leader Jeff stated that the Soviet government had issued a new order to remove offensive weapons and return them to the Soviet Union. Kennedy then responded, calling the Soviet leader's letter an important part of the peace strategy. Despite this, the United States continued to blockade Cuba. In the days that followed, reconnaissance flights showed that Soviet disarmament was progressing well. So the Cuban quarantine ended at 6 p.m. on November 20, 1962. The last U.S. rockets were dismantled on April 24, 1963. Many people argued that the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba to force the United States to remove NATO bases in southern Italy and Turkey, but there was no concrete evidence. On July 28, 1962, CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency in Havana, failed to detect an oncoming Soviet nuclear missile. So, for the next 6 weeks, they continued to provide false information to President Kennedy. For Cuba, the end of the missile crisis strengthened Cuban power in the world. However, the decision to resolve the crisis were negotiated by the US and the Soviet Union, so Cuba's interests were not guaranteed. Guantanamo Bay is still occupied by the US. On the US side, Underpilot Rudolph Anderson was the only person to die in the crisis. 11 members of the reconnaissance plane were killed in the crash. In 2017, the Russian Ministry of Defense released official information about the citizens killed in Cuba during the missile crisis. The exact number was not officially announced. However, an estimated 64 Soviet citizens were killed in Cuba.